A very warm welcome to today's MOOC. Today we have a great topic to share with you, which is best practices for DEX, Distributed Execution, with Tricentis Tosca. Before we begin, I would like to introduce you to our host for this session. My name is Jordan Grantham, and I'm a training consultant here in Tricentis Academy. Joining me today is Thomas Stocker, who is Product Manager for the Automation Platform. Welcome.
Hi Jordan, thanks for the invitation.
Before we start looking at distributed execution, I would first like to discuss some general housekeeping rules. For some of you who join our MOOCs on a regular basis, you'll have heard these many times before. But since there are some new people joining us for the first time, please allow me to talk about our housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted during the session. As there are hundreds of you currently attending, obviously everyone talking would be confusing and it would make the topic hard to follow. There is a control panel at the bottom of your screen with apps that you can toggle on or off. The key ones being Q&A, Twitter, Share, and the media player. Please make sure not to close the media player, as if you do, you will no longer be able to hear us. Even though you are muted, we do encourage you to ask questions during the session. Please use the Q&A box that I previously mentioned. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the MOOC. Therefore, we will hold the most interesting questions for the Q&A session so that everyone can benefit from the answers. We will, however, answer as many questions as possible during the session. But please be aware that only questions related to the current topics will be covered. Please keep in mind that given the number of attendees, we may not be able to answer all of your questions during the session. Finally, let me state that this session will be recorded and will be shared on our website later this week. Right, so I think that's enough of me talking. I will now hand over to Thomas, who will introduce you to distributed execution.
Thanks Jordan, and thanks everybody for joining today's MOOC. So, to start with, I want to state the question why we are doing this whole stuff, why you should use distributed execution in the first place. Well, there's several reasons. Let's start with the first one and the most obvious one, which is scaling. Let's assume you've already switched over to agile methodologies, you're using continuous integration with a build server in place, and you're running your tests overnight. That is fine to a certain extent, but at some point probably the amount of test cases exceeds the time you have available during, let's say, a nightly execution. Let's say you have several thousand test cases you want to run at least once a sprint for your regression portfolio, and they still will not run through the night as they exceed the 8 hours. So what to do here? The point is you have to distribute the execution among several agents. So one PC alone will not do the job. The next big thing we introduced is event planning. So our solution for distributed execution includes test events, which is nothing else than a kind of logical grouping of execution lists that make sense for a test event, for the execution of tests. And with this concept, you can plan your events based on what you want to test. Additionally, we added a monitoring component. So you now have the possibility not only to monitor the results or the execution itself on a Tosca installation, but you can also use any other device. As our monitoring component, our test event monitor is a web-based application, so it can be digested on any device. If it's a mobile device or a tablet or an old PC without Tosca installed, you can monitor what's going on within your tests at this very moment at any time. And last but not least, we have added a lot of functionality to make it as flexible as possible for you. So it's up to you. We've got a included load balancing for our distributed execution, but it's totally up to you to configure it in every way you want to have it. So you can configure what to run on which machine, or you can decide that distributed execution server itself takes care of that. All right, that's the why. Now let's go on with the how. For this, I want to start with the actual installation, so the setup. Therefore, I want to display you the general architecture of distributed execution. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, we've got a Tosca installation, so a PC or a virtual machine, including Tosca test suite installed, a workspace in place, and this workspace is connected to a common repository. On the right-hand side, we got here some additional machines listed, including Tosca test suite installed and a workspace, and all these workspaces point to one common repository. So this is probably the common setup you already have in place. And our goal was for distributed execution to have the possibility for you to leverage this existing environment. So you don't have to set up additional new agents, especially for distributed execution, but rather can leverage your existing environment, your existing ecosystem with Tosca Test Suite. So what is new? New is, if we have a look at the middle of our slide, that there is a server component called Tosca Server. Tosca Server itself is a Tosca component including all our web-based or server-based applications, grouping them together. And this also includes, among others, our Tosca distribution server and our Tosca event monitor. How does it all come together now? Well, basically, you will trigger the execution, you will trigger a test event from one specific machine or from the build server. It will be sent over to the Tosca distribution server, which then takes over the part of distributing the event items and execution lists among all the agents that are currently connected. And additionally, there's the Tosca event monitor that can visualize the current progress on any browser. So that's basically the architecture. Let's go over to the setup. To set up distributed execution, first of all, you will have to install Tosca Server. You get that from our support portal. Just install the components you would like to install. For distributed execution, as already mentioned, at least you have to install distributed execution server and the Tosca event monitor. This whole thing is designed as an IIS application, so it's the constraint or the prerequisite is that you have a Windows-based server machine with IIS installed. As soon as we have successfully installed Tosca Server, the first thing we do is we check if the installation was successful. Therefore, we simply open up the IIS manager. And on the left-hand side of the window, you can see the installed applications, and one of them is our Tosca server now. To see if it's successfully running, just go on the right-hand side and click the Browse button. This will open up the application in your local browser. And what is displayed initially, the landing page of Tosca server, which includes two sections. The upper section shows the installed sites, including these blue tiles. And these blue tiles represent the web applications that are installed, and you can, by clicking on them, you can open up the web application in a separate tab. And on the bottom area of the landing page, you see the installed services. So here for distributed execution, we've got our event monitor as the installed web page, and we've got the Tosca distribution server as the installed services. All right. I've done the setup, and I will demonstrate the whole concept and the setup and the usage based on Tosca 11.0, which is our upcoming release. There are slight changes compared to former versions. One of them, for example, is that there is no longer a service endpoint required on the agent. So keep that in mind. What's more, I will demonstrate the whole stuff on one machine because it's easier to follow instead of having several virtual machines open on one desktop. So just keep that in mind. To indicate which machine I'm currently on, I will change the desktop background. That should make it more obvious for you. All right, so now we are still on the server machine. We have Tosca server installed. It seems to be up and running. It's running in our browser. The next thing we want to do is set up our agents. The agents are basically normal, they are virtual machines, physical machines, whatever is suitable for you, with a normal standard Tosca installation. These agents have to connect to the Tosca server on a certain endpoint. So as soon as we are still on the server, we should kind of copy the endpoint we need so that we can connect the agent successfully to the server. How do we do that? Well, these endpoints are all part of the Tosca distribution server service. So we go back to our IIS manager, open up Tosca server application. There you can see all the applications installed, and one of them is the distribution server service, which basically is the whole service layer for distributed execution. By clicking Browse, we can open up the service definition here in our browser. If you get an error message when clicking on Browse, you first of all have to enable directory browsing on IIS. Okay, so here's our Tosca distribution server service, and it lists all the services involved, which is basically the communication service, the manager service, the monitor service, and the RDP master service. The distribution agent, which is the part we will set up next, is using the communication service. So this is the endpoint we have to remember because we need that to put in on the agent side to connect to the server. So we simply click on that endpoint. There we get the whole service definition, and then we just copy the address mentioned here in the browser and store it anywhere where we can access it from our agent machine. Okay? So that's it basically from the server side. Now we're switching over to our clients. So now we want to set up our distribution agents. As already mentioned, a distribution agent is nothing else than one of your existing machines with Tricentis Tosca installed. Let's have a look into a Tosca standard installation. If you have Tosca installed, you can move over to Tricentis Home. And there you see a folder called Distributed Execution. And this folder includes all components necessary for the agent. Here you got an agent directory, and that includes all components necessary for configuring your standard Tosca installation to be a execution agent. And the only thing you have to do here basically is double click on the agents. So start the agent. The agent is a long-running executable, and this long-running executable should you start it once, and it will then be idle and ready for the execution. So it will be available from outside. If your agent will restart from time to time, it totally makes sense to put it into the machine's startup. Okay. So we've got our agent started. In the tray icon, in the system tray, we now get an icon for the agent. And if we select the icon and click on Configure Agent, we get a configuration dialog for our agent. And the first thing we do is we want to connect it to the server. So recently we've been on the server, we've selected the communication service and remembered the endpoint for the server. So what we do now is we switch over to the Connect to Server tab, and here's the server address. Here we input our server address. And if everything works out fine, we get a green check mark on the right-hand side, which means our agent successfully connected to the server. So now he is idle and available for getting execution requests. There's additional configurations here we'll come to later. Basically, besides connecting to the server, there's one thing we have to do, which is we have to connect it to a certain workspace. As initially mentioned, we are leveraging the existing environment. So you have workspaces, they are connected to one common repository. And this is why we now have to connect our agent to a certain workspace. This is done by simply clicking Setup Workspace. And here you select the workspace, you have a file chooser for that, you select the TWS file for that, input the user and the password to log into the workspace, and that's basically it. We hit OK and our agent is up and running. Alright, we do that for all agents we want to add to distributed execution. So you can start with a few, but of course you can add later on additional agents if you want to. Good. So we've got our server up and running, we've got our agents up and running. The next thing is to create a test event and to kick it off, because we want to see how distributed execution basically works. As mentioned initially within our architecture, our idea is that you have a certain one or n designer machines or master machines that kind of act as machines where you define test events and kick them off. And then you've got the execution machines, which are basically our distribution agents. So on any machine that is connected to the same repository, you can now use that machine to act as your master machine, where you create your test events and kick them off. What has to be done for that? First of all, we have to connect it to the server as well. There's two endpoints we have to add. Therefore, we go to the settings. Here we've got the commander options, and with that there is an extra section called distributed execution, which includes basically two settings, one for the event monitor, so the address where our event monitor is hosted, and one for the server. Here you can see Tosca Commander uses the manager service, so the master machine kicking off the test events uses the manager service, in comparison to the distribution agent, which is consuming the communication service. All right, so we set these endpoints accordingly to our server installation, and that's basically it. We can start with creating our artifacts. Good. So starting point is the execution section. As you already possibly have seen, the execution section includes now two different object types. One is called configurations, and the other one is called test events. What is it? Let's start with the test events. Test events, what are test events? Basically, test events are kind of a collection of execution lists, so executable items that make sense together, that can be grouped logically together. Like here, I have an example. I created one called API tests. I created one called regression tests or smoke tests. You can simply create them by doing a right click on the test events root and clicking on the create new test event item. We give it a name. Let's say my demo test event. And the only thing that is missing is you drag and drop the execution list you want to have to be executed by this test event into your test event. This is simply drag and drop option. As soon as you've done that, there is an execution list link appearing under your test event. So then you are already ready to go. You can kick off your test event. This is done by simply doing a right click and saying execute now. As you can see, the task is finished now in Tosca Commander. Why? Because this is a fire and forget. We kick off the test event, it's sent to the distribution server where it's processed and distributed among all the agents available, executed, and that's it. To get a state about the current execution status, we can open up the Tosca Event Monitor, our web application, and as soon as the event is done there, we can do an update all here within our master workspace and get the results within the workspace as well. So to open up the event monitor, we've got a handy functionality here. There's a context menu task called Open Tosca Event Monitor. which opens up the monitor within a browser. Here you can see the monitor is running and our demo test event was already sent to the distribution server, so it's already on the server and it's gonna be distributed. At the moment it just includes one execution list, so it's sent to one agent. Agent 1 is currently working on that. While this is processed, let's go back to our master workspace and have a look at the configurations section. Configuration section has certain configuration possibilities. The first thing I want to start with is within the configuration sections we provide a task called refresh agents, and if you hit that task you get a list of all your distribution agents that are currently connected to this common repository and to this Tosca distribution server. There's several default configurations like the ANY and the RDP, but you can create your own configurations. We will come to that later on. So let's have a look at the ANY configuration. Here you can see that 3 agents appeared. So at the moment I have 3 agents connected to the Tosca distribution server. As you can see, they have the icons have different background colors, which indicates the current state of the agent. This one, the first one, as you can see, has a tooltip called executing. So orange means this agent is currently executing stuff. In comparison to the other agents, agents 2 and 3, they are idle. So they are not doing anything at the moment because we just send over one execution list. All right, so let's switch over to our test event monitor and let's see what our test event is doing. It's already arrived at the agent and the agent is executing our tests. Good. Until it's finished, let's talk about configurations. Therefore, we switch over to our initial test event, our demo test event. We just dragged and dropped one execution list into our test event. If we hit execute now, and what happens is it's distributed to any agent available at the moment. So it doesn't matter which agent, the first one that is idle and available will get this item. What if you want to send it to one specific agent? So let's say you've got tests that only run on a specific environment, so you cannot send them by default to any agent. So you want to group that, or you want to specify which agent to use or which group of agents to use. That's why we introduced configurations. Configurations basically, every agent provides a set of basic configurations. These are system configurations that we gather. To display that, I'll open up an agent configuration. Here we are. So let's assume we are now back on the distribution agent. And there is a section called Configure Machine. This includes a few settings, system settings that are already filled out by default because we try to gather them from your system, like the operating system, the memory available, the type, is it 64, 32-bit, the IP address, and the host name. Of course, you can configure them if you want to, so you can select from an existing list or edit them manually. For example, it perfectly makes sense to edit the host name if your existing host name is kind of cryptic string. It makes perfectly sense to give it a logical name. So let's say you've got 100 of agents, which is a common scenario. We've got customers with several hundred agents running. Then you just give it a logical name to make it easier for you within your master workspace to identify which agent this actually is. Here I named it agent 1. So these configurations are now available and you can set them on every agent and you can use them on your master PC for configuring your test events. So as mentioned, let's refresh them again. They are done, so our test event is finished. As mentioned, within our initial test event demo, the execution list was distributed to any idle agent. Let's say we want to make it specific. Therefore, we want to make a specific configuration. First of all, we can add all the configurations available here via the column chooser in the configuration section, which is hostname, IP address, memory, operating system type, and user RDP. Here they are, and you see the corresponding configurations for each agent. And at the moment, it seems we've got 2 agents running Windows 10 and 1 running Windows 7. Here I already have a prepared configuration. You can create your own configurations as well. Let's say you have a specific configuration with 32-bit, for example, because one of your application needs to be able to run on 32-bit. That's why you have one specific agent for that. So you create the configuration and you set the values accordingly. And by hitting refresh agent, you see if there is an agent matching. At the moment, there is no agent matching, but for demo purposes, I will configure now one agent to be 32-bit to make it visible to you. Alright, so this is the agent 2. I make the agent 2 a 32-bit agent. I hit refresh agents in my master workspace, and as you can see now, we've got one agent, the agent 2, that is obviously running a 32-bit system. So now we want to leverage that configuration, of course, within our test event, because we want to run the whole test event or specific items within the test event on this very specific agent, or agent groups if it's several agents. And this is pretty simple. We simply go to our test event, drag and drop the configuration, and use any specific use an execution list link and drop it under our configurations. So let's have a look at our current demo test event. If we run this test event now, the following happens. Execution list 1 will be distributed. Let's give it a try. Let's kick it off. What happens now is execution list 1 will be distributed to any agent available, but execution list 2 will only be distributed to agents that support that configuration. So in this case, that have 32-bit environment. Here we've got a column called number of agents. So you have already a view on how many agents you generally have available, which is 3, and how many agents match your specific configuration, which obviously is only 1 at the moment. Okay? So let's go back to our configurations. 32-bit, only agent 2 matches this configurations. So the assumption is that our execution list 2 will be run on agent 2. To verify this, let's switch over again to our test event monitor. This is our demo test event. It was already sent to our agents, and as you can see, execution list 1 is sent to any agent. In this case, it's agent 1 because it's the first one that was available, and execution list 2, which needs a certain configuration, was sent to agent 2. Okay? So this concept of configurations helps you to make the whole configuration, the whole execution more specific. So we've got an integrated load balancing. We decide on which item to send to which agent, but you can configure that if you want to. All right, that's basically it within Tosca Commander. You create test event, you configure them, you kick them off. You can monitor the execution progress on the event monitor, and then you can sync back the results by simply hitting update all, because they are all part of the repository. It seems pretty easy. It's definitely usable, but the point is, most likely you will work in a CI environment, so you want to have that whole thing kicked off by your build server that should be integrated into your pipeline. Sure, we know that. That's why we provide a possibility to do that. So to demonstrate this, I have prepared here a Jenkins instance with a certain new project. I created a project here, and I want to show you how to integrate the execution of these test events via your build server. Basically, this whole CI integration is done via our CI solution. So we've got our Tosca CI integration, Tosca CI, which is part of any Tosca installation. So you can simply leverage that package, put it onto your build server, and kick off the test events. I'll just show you within the file system. This is a standard Tosca installation, and within Tricentis Home you've got a folder called Tosca CI, and this includes all the components necessary. For our purposes, to kick off test events via CI, we simply use this client package. So we copy this client package from any existing Tosca installation over to our build server machine, because there we need it. And if we have it there, then we can configure our build to run the tests. This is fairly simple. It's basically just 2 steps. To demonstrate that, I switch over to the Configure tab within Jenkins. This is a pretty simple project I have here. Basically, there is no build steps. I just added the integration steps. So let's assume you have your build server, whatever build server it is. We basically support any type of build server. I just use Jenkins for demonstration purposes. It's easy to set up, and it's commonly and widely used out there at our customers. But basically, we support any build server. We at Tricentis, for example, we of course use our own tools internally, and we are using Quick Build as our build tool. Why it's usable and why it's so generic and usable in any build server? Because it's simply a client that is called with certain parameters and returns a result in a certain format that can be read by any build server. So here is how we configure it. As I said, it's 2 steps. First of all, you have to kick off the tests. In Jenkins, this is done by adding a build step called execute Windows batch command if you are on a Windows system. If you are on a non-Windows system, let's say your build server is Linux based, this is possible as well. So instead of then kicking off Tosca CI client executable, you select the Tosca CI client jar. Good. So let's have a look at the parameters we have to provide. There's several parameters. First of all, -m, which indicates the mode. In this case, it's the distributed mode. Why is that the case? Because Tosca CI could run your tests locally on your build server as well, if required. But that's a fairly rare scenario. So most of the time you will distribute it to the distribution server, which then executes it on all your agents. So for kicking off test events with CI, you use the mode distributed. Next one, -t, is the parameter for the type of result. We generally we support 2 types of results. One is a Tosca generic XML format for our results, and the other one, which is the commonly used and which should be used here as well, is the JUnit format. Why? Because any build server can pick a JUnit result and display it in a nice format. Next parameter, -e, is the endpoint. And here we add the endpoint to the distribution server, because Tosca CI sends the execution request to the distribution server, which then distributes the items among all agents. We've already seen the monitor service and the communication service. Communication service is used by the communication between distribution agent and server. Monitor service is used by the DEX event monitor to communicate with the DEX server. And here we've got the manager service, which is used by Tosca CI. All right, this is the endpoint. Last parameter, the next parameter, -c, is the configuration. If we kick off test events, of course we want to define what test event I want to kick off. How do you do that? Well, basically, we've got the concept of the test config XML, which is a simple XML file including a lot of different configurations. You can look them up within our online documentations. And one possible configuration is putting in the name or the node path of a test event. I've got an example here in Notepad. So let me quickly open up that. Here we've got a test config XML. Root element is test configuration, and then there is an option to add a configuration called test events, which is basically a collection. And here you input all the test events you want to run with this specific build. What to input here? Well, you can use the name. Here you can see I'm using the name regression. Let's switch over to our master machine. Here I have a prepared test event called regression, including an execution list. Instead of using the test event name, because let's assume you are in a huge repository with, let's say, 10 gigabytes, then it probably takes some time to find the test event by name. So instead of using the test event name, you could also input the node path to the test event here, which is a defined path to the test event and therefore pretty fast and pretty easy to find for us. All right, so within this test config XML, we define which test events to run, and within Jenkins, we just provide with the configuration parameter -c this configuration file. And the last parameter necessary is the result path. Why is this necessary? Tosca CI kicks off the test events, they are executed on your agents, and the results are stored within your common repository. But of course, if you kick them off, while you build, then you want to have the results on your build machine as well, because the build should either fail or pass, depending on your test results. So Tosca CI receives back the results in the format JUnit as an XML file, and you have to define where to store them, because depending on where you store them, your build server can read them accordingly. In Jenkins, there is a certain workspace directory, and here, as you can see, there is it's within program files, Jenkins, workspace, and here is my project, and that's where I have to store my result XML, because that's where Jenkins will pick up the result XML to display it. And that's basically it for the setup of the step itself. So if we have set up that, we can kick off our test events. So we can go to the project and say build now, and our build will start and our tests will be kicked off. Of course, this only gives back the results, but we want to display the results as well, which is why we have to add one additional step. In Jenkins, it's called a post-build action of the type publish JUnit test result. So depending on your build server, it's probably different. The point is, within the first step, we kicked off the execution and provided the result at a certain position. And with the next step, we are picking up the result so that the build server can display it. In my case, I only have to provide the name, because Jenkins, as already mentioned, automatically looks up the result in the workspace directory. So that's basically it. So we've got two steps, a build step, which basically kicks off the event, and a post-build action to display the result. All right, if we've done that, let's have a look at our current build. If we kick off our build, you can see within the console output what's going on. So here you can see Tosca CI client was started. It was started at a certain endpoint, which is our distribution server. And from then on, we are polling the distribution server for a result. In my case now, it's done every second or every few seconds, but you can define that on your own. So there's a timeout you can define, and there's an interval you can define for polling the DEX server. So if you have tests where you already know that they probably are running, let's say, 2 hours or more, then it doesn't make sense to poll every second for a result, but rather say every hour or something like that. Good. So Jenkins already triggered the build, already triggered the test execution. The tests are running, And within our event view, we can see that the regression tests were kicked off, and at the moment they are running on agent 2. It seems that it consists of 3 test cases. 2 of them are already passed, and the last one is ongoing. Let's see, now all 3 are passed. Let's wait until the event is finished. So here the event monitor says, all right, my event is done. So you can consume that, as you can digest it on any device. So there's the build server, but besides the build server, you can use your mobile phone and always check what's going on. How are your tests doing? So let's switch over to our build. The build said it's done, test results are here, and it's finished, and it was successful. So we did not reveal any failure. So let's switch over to the project. This is our latest build. Let's have a look at the result. That's probably not that impressive here because everything is passed, no failure. If there is a failure, you have a more detailed view on the failure, but here you can see it was the executionist 1. These are the 3 test cases, and all of them passed. And that's basically it for the CI integration. So it's pretty simple. It's just 2 steps. Call the client, give it some parameters, give it the name of the test events you want to run, and add an additional step to display the result. All right, so you may say that's pretty cool, seems to be easy to set up, I can run my tests, but what if your machines are locked? So let's assume you're running UI tests and your machine is locked. What will happen? If you're running API tests on a locked computer, they will pass. So no worries with that, that will work pretty fine. But what if you are running tests on running UI tests on a locked screen? Well, basically they will fail. That's a constraint of Windows. Nobody can work around that, so every automation tool is confronted with that issue. On the locked screen, you don't have an active user session, no active windows, therefore your any user simulations or any keyboard commands, any mouse commands will fail. So what can you do in that scenario? One point you can do is simply don't lock your machines. This, of course, is not very practical, especially due to security reasons. We know that, which is why we have a built-in solution within Tosca Distributed Execution for this. And this brings me back to our master instance and to our configurations. As you may recall, there have been some default configurations. One was the any configurations displaying all agents available, and the other one is called the RDP configuration. What does it mean? Well, basically, Tosca Distributed Execution includes a functionality to automatically open up an RDP session at the beginning of the test execution to your agents, doing the execution and closing the RDP session afterwards. This enables you to run UI tests even on locked screen. Because the screen is locked, we are unlocking it, so we are opening up an RDP session, running the tests, and closing the RDP session afterwards. How is that done? Therefore, you've got the RDP server, which is part of the Tosca distribution server, and the only thing to do is you have to configure your agents accordingly. So let's go back to one of our agents. We hit configure agent, the configuration dialog appears, and as you can see here, there's an additional section called unattended execution. This section basically displays your RDP settings that are currently in place on this very machine. Okay, so in this machine, it seems allow to open up remote connections to this computer. If it's on don't allow, just switch over to allow. If you want to make it possible to use this built-in RDP feature, so you say allow to open up remote, and then you have to enable it. You want to say yes, please use RDP connections to this distribution agent. This is simply done by providing a user and password. No worries, these credentials are of course encrypted on your machine, and if they are transferred to the server, they are encrypted as well. So no security issue here. What happens now during execution is, so let's say you have your UI tests. Let's go back to our demo test event. Let's say we have UI tests and we want to run them definitely on machines that have a no OpenRDP session, because your machines are locked and you want to make it work. You still want to make it work. What you do is the same thing as you did for every other configurations. You just drag and drop your RDP configuration and drag and drop your execution list you want to run under that specific configuration, So what happens now is these two execution lists, part of the test events, will only be run on agents that first of all support RDP. And what happens is, if we come to that execution list, the Tosca distribution server will open up an RDP session to that machine, run the tests, and close the RDP session afterwards. That's done for every agent involved and supporting RDP. So one thing to mention here is, let's say you've got hundreds of agents and all of them should open up an RDP session. That could lead to performance issues if your server machine where you have Tosca distribution server hosted is not that performant, if it has not the right stats for that. So keep in mind, we have to open up one RDP session for each and every agent that supports RDP. So the idea is to group together your UI tests that require RDP within that RDP configuration, and all other tests that do not need any active screen can be grouped together besides that RDP configuration. All right, that's basically it from my side. That was distributed execution in a nutshell. There's a lot of additional things we can unfortunately not cover today due to time constraints. But nevertheless, you can contact us via support. You can contact me directly via email with any questions. So there's a lot of additional stuff and there's a lot of stuff to come. So therefore, watch out for webinars, watch out for our What's New. And therefore, with this, I want to hand over to you for probably some questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the demonstration. So yes, as you mentioned, we're now at the point where we can ask some of your questions that you've been asking during the demonstration. As I mentioned in the beginning, in our housekeeping, we did keep a few questions from the session so that we can answer them in detail here at the end of the presentation, so that everyone can profit from the answers. So first question I have for you, Thomas. Can I add additional configuration parameters besides the default ones?
That's a good question. As I've shown you, there is a set of default configuration parameters which are basically system parameters. So operating system type, bit size, and so on. So these are default configurations we have come up because they are generic. They can be used in every agent. But of course, it makes perfectly sense for you to have your custom properties. Let's say you have environments, you have agents where one specific application can run. Probably you have SAP tests and they will only run on specific agents that have SAP installed. Simply create a configuration parameter for that and configure it accordingly, and you can use it as any other configurations. How to do that? Well, on the distribution server, there's the possibility to add these configuration params within the configuration parameters XML file. And as soon as you've done that, you restart the server and they will appear in the agent's configurations where you then can configure them. And that gives you a lot of flexibility and makes it possible to define a lot of different parameters for you depending on what your needs are. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Next question then. So in our demonstration we had 3 agents. Do the agents have to be online all the time, or is it possible to spin them up on demand?
Yeah, it's right. At the moment we've got an environment where we kick off test events and they will be sent to idle agents. So agents that are connected to the distribution server and therefore can receive execution requests. Of course, if you are not constantly executing tests on that environment, you don't want to have your agents idling around all the time. We know that, and we will address that with a kind of orchestration concept in the future. In the meantime, of course, this is solvable as well. Just to give an example how we internally at Tricentis are doing that, because we are running our tests internally nightly as well. We are using distributed execution for this as well. And what in our case, the orchestration is done by the build server, because the build server is basically the master instance for the whole build. So what the build server does, before starting the execution, it starts up the agent machines. The distributed execution agent executable is in the startup, so as soon as the machine is started up, the agent will start up and it will automatically register at the distribution server, and therefore it will be available for executing test events. That's how we do it. And at the end, the build server tears them down again. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question. So towards the end of your demonstration, you showed us some RDP sessions. What if the distribution execution server is hosted on a server machine that is not capable of opening up RDP sessions to other machines?
Exactly. That can happen. We've experienced that with customers. So they are hosting distribution server really on a Windows server machine, which is simply not capable of opening up RDP sessions, because opening up an RDP session requires having an active window, because the RDP session runs in a window, in a frame. If this is not possible for you, no worries. The communication between the RDP server and the distribution server is done via a web service. So you simply take the RDP server package, which is again part of a normal standard Tosca installation, copy it to any machine that is capable of opening up the RDP sessions, and then connect that with the distribution server via this endpoint. It's just an endpoint address, it should be reachable for both, and then you're ready to go.
Okay, thank you. And a second question then to RDP. For some people, it may be that using RDP for unattended execution isn't an option due to security reasons within their company. How can they make sure that UI tests still work?
Okay, it can be difficult to open up RDP session in a closed environment. Got that. Several possibilities. First one I think I already mentioned is simply doing the orchestration via the build server. The other one, of course, would be to do the orchestration with any other component. So with any component, start up the machine, do it within your tests even, that could be possible. And in the near future, we'll come up with a possibility that you can do this orchestration, starting up the machines and closing them down directly in Tosca. Besides that, of course, group your test events based on tests that need an active session and that don't need an active session. What's more, you can influence that within your tests itself. So even UI tests do only need an active session if your test steps or your test actions include user simulation. User simulation means a click operation or a keyboard input. By avoiding this can be using, for example, X instead of click, because that's a method invocation instead of an an actual mouse click. And so using method invocation instead of user simulation. That's basically a possibility to avoid that as well. All right?
Okay, so thank you for those answers. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for on questions. So my apologies if we didn't get around to answering your question. Just before we finish up, I would like to remind you of our upcoming MOOC, which will cover agile testing. So the title there is What the World Needs Now is Agile Testing with Tricentis Tosca. The session will be taking place on November the 29th. And as always, we will have 2 sessions to cover 2 different time zones. Here they're in Central European time, so in the morning from 10 till 11, and in the afternoon from 5:30 until 6:30. You can already register for this MOOC on our website. If you go to the home page, go to the Academy tab and click on MOOCs. I think this will be a great MOOC, so if you're already working in an agile way, this will be a great one for you to take part in. Even if you don't work in an agile way, then do join us for this one, because maybe we can share with you how you could integrate an agile approach into your projects. Also, I would kindly ask you to complete the feedback at the end of this session. We're always really grateful for your feedback, so if you do have time, that would be much appreciated. Finally then, I would just like you to have a look at this slide to guide you to any further assistance if you need it. At the top we have there 2 email addresses, as Thomas mentioned. If you have any technical questions, please do let us know by emailing support@tricentis.com. If you have any training related questions, any questions related specifically to training, then do contact us here at the Academy using the email address academy@tricentis.com. Below there we have 2 links to the knowledge base and the online manual. The knowledge base and the online manual there providing support to you through articles, through our community, to any questions you may have. If you've enjoyed this MOOC and would like to look at previous MOOCs, the link below lists any previous MOOCs that we've had. Just as this MOOC is being recorded, all the previous MOOCs have also been recorded and are available through our website. Finally, you can find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. On YouTube, if you haven't already been to our channel, you can find there our Tosca in a Heartbeat videos. There's some very short videos, only a few minutes, that handle a specific topic within Tosca, so do check those out too. Finally then, I would like to thank you very much again for joining us, and to wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.
Bye bye.